Today, we are going to talk about XLM and how it seems like a lot of things are happening all at once. And today is really about their involvement with UN programs. Probably over a year ago now, I talked about a program in the Asian Pacific called APFI, and I was actually able to show the on-chain evidence. And a lot of the most popular UN involvement actually comes out of the UNHCR and their involvement with humanitarian aid in Ukraine that has actually turned into a fully operational blockchain financial infrastructure. Here, I will explain how Binance is actually involved in it too. So they have said that multiple governments and sovereign wealth funds have approached them about creating crypto reserves, which stood out as pretty unusual for an exchange. And if you combine statements like that with the fact that they have 1 billion XLM at this point, and they have increased it a lot since early 2024, it tends to track with a lot of their involvement with the UN. In 2022, they donated $2.5 million of BUSD, and that was directly related to the humanitarian aid in Ukraine. It is also interesting that there is some talk about Trump's family looking to acquire a stake in the exchange too. Stellar has been talking about the UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, I think, and they are working together with them in order to provide payment solutions, which makes perfect sense because of all of their experience with MoneyGram and Circle with the Ukrainian effort. And a comment here on the scope of it. The UN has offices in 193 countries, and the more that these kinds of quote-unquote humanitarian aid projects happen, where Stellar is the underlying foundation of it all, that's humanitarian aid right now, but just like in Ukraine, that turned into a CBDC pilot and an entire national banking system infrastructure. The UN in Europe and Central Asia has officially endorsed Stellar for their financial framework, and the UN is the parent organization of the World Bank, which has called out Ripple and Stellar in the past, which ties in to my whole two sides of the same coin theory. And once again, we are able to find more and more connections, not only in between these two entities, but into actual application happening right now. Here is a little note on the IMF World Bank part of things. And I haven't really looked through this a whole lot because the World Bank has actually called out XRP and XLM as essentially stablecoins because they're able to transact so quickly that the price fluctuations are not a problem. I think that was from 2018 off the top of my head. Here is the TLDR of the press releases out there. The strategic partnership will use Stellar. The key areas of impact, they're transparent and efficient, which the word transparent is always interesting because the Ukrainian network is actually called the Transparent Network. Got some general statements from the UNDP and from Stellar, and they talk about more pilots, knowledge sharing, and capacity, and all of that stuff. Here is another piece of information from the UN talking about Stellar and Ripple, which is from the UN Capital Development Fund.
All of the existing networks. And this is kind of what it would look like. It's not a new system, but it connects existing systems. So no matter whether it is incumbents like Swift, Visa, MasterCard, or some of the newer networks like Ripple, Stellar, Celo, a payment should be able to go from one to another.
And that is about it. It is an older one, I think, so it's not too specific. Here we get into a little bit more of the Stellar Direct ties into things and Binance, and then spending a little time reviewing the APFI stuff. So it was a few months ago now. This Stellar XLM rich list chart was being posted a lot after one of the Stellar accounts had a post that was allegedly calling out XRP, which it might have, but I don't really care. And the fact that a lot of people were emotionally invested enough to be upset about it is kind of concerning in my own humble opinion. But my point here is that I don't know where this chart was actually made, but it is absolutely incorrect. I don't have it up in front of me because I'm not interested in actually arguing about it. But if you go on Stellar Expert, then these percentages are not correct at all. And a bunch of people just reposted this out of emotion and they had a fit. But one of the more interesting points that was made to people who were so upset is that at that exact time, the UNDP was actually talking about Stellar. Stellar has had over 2 years of Stellar aid assist, which means over 2 years of working with the UNHCR. And now they are expanding their work and their cooperation into Argentina. And I know that I've talked about a couple of things that relate to Argentina. I think one of the Hyperledger projects out of Cheesecake Labs was talking about Argentina. Can't remember off the top of my head, and it's not important right now. It kind of is really interesting where the UNHCR has gone. It has resulted in some kind of a massive involvement of Stellar in that country's financial infrastructure. About a year ago, Stellar put out the open source release of the Stellar disbursement platform, which is essentially a remittance tool, but a remittance is essentially a cross-border payment. So, in my own humble opinion, I think the talk of Stellar and even Ripple about banking the unbanked and a lot of involvement with these humanitarian kind of projects and organizations, yes, that is a net positive, but it's kind of a way to get your hands on things without attracting a lot of attention and making it seem as if you're just in it to get control or to make. I think it's all been some kind of a partial cover up in order to actually create these kinds of infrastructures. But it does run through the Ukrainian involvement. It's now open source, which is extremely interesting because that essentially says this cross-border payment network is now freely available to anyone who wants to tie that into their own project or their own company on top of Stellar. I think I've shown how Stellar and the UN can be extremely interconnected over time, and I've done a number of things on APFI and on the Ukrainian infrastructure. Here we're going to talk about this new thing with Binance. And at the end of 2024, they announced an upcoming rebrand with plans to concentrate on crypto, AI, and biotech in 2025. That sounds extremely strange for a crypto exchange company, but it also ties into this post that I talked about earlier, where it sounds like people were actually approaching them as if they were some kind of a financial institution or a bank, which I would imagine they probably have a lot of things hidden. In April, they announced support for Apple Pay and Google Pay, which, as stablecoins become more and more popular, and especially once they get full approval in the US, it's just another way to get volume. So it's just making it a lot easier for people to work with your own company. And then on that note, because we were talking about Apple Pay and Google Pay, Binance Pay is also a thing. And they are working with Circle, and USDC is now the default currency. And it is not a US company. I think there's still an entity in the US, but that just kind of is a point that lines up with how I say once we get stablecoin regulations, the USD will hold on to its current dominance or it will increase. Here's a note from the CEO of Circle on it too, so it is not just a random announcement. I also found it interesting that there's something happening here where it ties in centralized exchange operations and DEX operations. And it's able to keep all of that running through the centralized exchange, which has AML and KYC compliance, which kind of sounds as if Binance is heading towards becoming some kind of an institution or some kind of a bank. EZ has also been talking about stablecoins, and he kind of seemed to poke at RLUSD. And that's probably because he's been working with Circle and USDC, which a lot of the XRPL army say that the RLUSD is the only quote unquote compliant US stablecoin, but I haven't gotten extremely into that topic yet, but I don't really see where that's true, especially because USDC is the most popular US stablecoin right now, and it's MiCA compliant along with the EURC. So I will have more on that here soon. As far as Binance and Stellar go, Remit Ease was on with Stellar on Binance Live, which I don't really think is a huge thing on its own, but it's another interesting data point, especially with how Binance and Stellar have been involved in these humanitarian aid things, which translate directly into remittances. So at this point, it's only a data point. There's also some potential huge integration with Velo that I have talked about a lot in the past. I haven't talked a lot about Velo in a while, not for anything in particular other than I got so behind on everything that I just kind of got overwhelmed. However, I have a couple of things related to Velo coming out again here soon. One interesting thing is that Velo and Ripple are involved with a company called Open Eden, who is tokenizing US Treasury bills. And it appears as if Binance has actually invested in them too. And with Velo still publicly calling out Jed and David Mazieres of Stellar on their site, that just kind of points to yet another interconnection into Stellar. With the Circle and USDC preference especially, what if BlackRock is actually trying to do some kind of an acquisition over Binance? I don't know, but they are extremely involved with Circle and even Coinbase. And a big point in that is that there is no way that BlackRock will allow Binance to profit. So especially if Binance is trying to become some kind of a much larger financial institution, I can certainly see that happening, but I wouldn't be too surprised. Apparently, Binance has been taking an interest in Onondo, which has heavy ties into BlackRock, and the CMO or the CFO, I always forget what his official title is. His name is Ben Grossman. He is an ex-Stellar executive, so it just has another interconnection there too. While we're talking about exchanges, I've got some stuff related to OKX, but it was interesting here because the FDCI was actually spun out of a UN program and is headed by David Mazieres, who was responsible for creating what is now the consensus protocol for Stellar, which I think happened in 2015. And then another UN thing. In 2021, UNICEF put 300K into crypto startups. And one of those was actually powered off of Stellar, which was called Leaf. And I have no idea, but it's just another interconnection into Stellar. And it just so happens to call out an Argentinian startup called XCapit, which is interesting because Stellar was talking about expanding the UNHCR work into Argentina. An interesting thing here, which I have a little bit more coming up on, Elon Musk actually responded to this question about putting the Treasury on chain so that you don't have any fraudulent payments or anything like that. And he responded yes, to which DCM, who is the company that worked with Stellar to create the financial infrastructure in Ukraine, they actually responded, hey, have actually created this and it's online right now. If not the only one, it is one of the few out there. So that is just another really interesting point. And just kind of a reminder about APFI, that was actually right out of the UNDP as well, but in the Pacific office. I have an entire playlist on this. It's called I Proved the QFS, which I probably wouldn't have called it that now, but I have tons and tons of specific information on it there. And APFI systems essentially outlines what the program was. It involves IBM, it refers to WorldWire in a couple of areas at about the same time. You got ClickX and a couple of other major money processors and payment processors. And I was trying to open up the site on Robert Bell, who is the one who is actually in charge of this. And that is him right here. But on his site, it actually calls out a little bit more. He has a lot of experience with the IMF and SWIFT and a couple of other things. So it's just one more example of how interconnected Stellar and the UN actually are.